Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It feels like engineering.
Right, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is, that's the fracture.
It's totally binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not broken.
Exactly. And there is immense comfort in that. We desperately want our crises to be visible, categorized, and, immediate.
Oh, for sure.
But then you step into the world of, say, neurodevelopment or chronic autoimmune conditions or deep systemic trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine it's useless.
Yeah, completely.
You're navigating these diagnostic muddy waters where the breakdown is invisible right up until the exact moment of total systemic failure.
And the really terrifying part is that the breakdown has been compounding for years, completely unnoticed because you were looking for a clean break instead of a slow rot.
Which brings us to the core of what we are doing today on this deep dive. Because that exact same diagnostic illusion, this desperate desire for a simple, highly visible binary crisis, it happens when we look at the collapse of entire civilization.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
We are stepping into the clinic of history today, and we are stripping away literally centuries of religious sentimentality, superstition, theological padding, all of it to examine a foundational text.
And we really need to be clear about the angle here.
So specifically, we are analyzing a 1976 lecture delivered by the thinker Ghulam Ahmed Parwez, where he dissects the opening verses of Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 1 through 10 from the Quran.
And I think we have to establish the ground rules for this analysis immediately. We are not approaching this as a theology lesson.
Yeah.
No, wasn't either. We are looking at the source material through the lens of pure sociology. Think of this as two systems engineers evaluating a master blueprint for civilizational survival.
I love that framing.
Because Parwez's argument is that this ancient text doesn't just offer, moral platitudes. It contains hard, immutable laws of social physics. These are mechanical laws that dictate the rise, the stagnation, and the violent collapse of human societies.
And the reason you, the listener, should care about this is because these laws of social physics are operating right now in the background of our hyper-connected, algorithmic modern world, exactly as they did in antiquity.
They haven't changed a bit.
So Parwez starts his analysis by tearing down perhaps the biggest misconception in classical commentary, focusing on this explosive Arabic phrase right in the first verse, Zalzalat as-Sa.
Yeah, and if you look at centuries of traditional commentaries, they almost universally frame Zalzalat as-Sa as a literal geological apocalypse.
Right, the end of the world.
Exactly. They describe this supernatural earthquake, this terrifying day of judgment where the physical planet just arbitrarily shakes itself to pieces at the end of time, usually as a precursor to the afterlife.
It's the ultimate Hollywood disaster movie framing.
That's exactly what it is.
And it's comforting in a weird way because, if the threat is a magical earthquake that happens at the end of time, you don't actually have to do anything about it today. It's out of your hands.
Right, and that is the crux of Parwez's critique. He calls that supernatural framing a lazy intellectual placeholder.
The placeholder.
Yeah, because when a society loses its grasp on the complex socioeconomic mechanics that actually govern human behavior, it is incredibly convenient to relegate warnings of destruction to the realm of magic.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense.
But Parwez looks at the etymology and the historical context, and he reframes as-Sa entirely. It is not an apocalyptic event waiting for you after death. It is a hard law of social physics operating in this world.
Okay, so mechanically, what is it then?
It's the fast-arriving, unavoidable tipping point. Think of a bridge where the engineers have ignored the load limits for decades, right?
Okay.
They're allowing heavier and heavier freight to cross while completely ignoring the microfractures in the concrete. The collapse of that bridge isn't a magical punishment from the sky.
No, it's just physics.
It is the mathematical inevitability of accumulated stress. So Zalzalat as-Sa is the moment when a corrupt social order, weighed down by its own accumulated injustices, wealth hoarding, and systemic imbalances, violently shakes and collapses.
A socioeconomic earthquake, not a tectonic one.
A revolution and a reckoning. When a society builds its foundations on exploitation, there is a structural tension that builds up over time. Eventually, the load-bearing pillars of that society snap.
Yeah.
That violent, terrifying disintegration of the old order where everything you thought was stable suddenly isn't, that is the earthquake.
Man, that drastically changes the stakes of this entire text. Like if you were listening to this on your commute or prepping for a board meeting or just scrolling the news and feeling that heavy underlying hum of anxiety about our institutions, This linguistic distinction is vital.
It really is.
We aren't waiting for a comet. We are looking at the structural fractures in the systems we rely on to put food on our tables today, which demands a strategy, right?
Yeah.
If the earthquake is a systemic collapse, how do you prepare for it?
And that is exactly where the text issues its first major demand, Takwa Rabbakum.
Conventionally, that is translated with a very passive medieval framing, right? Like, fear your Lord or be pious.
Yeah, it evokes images of retreating to a monastery, praying quietly, and just hoping the storm passes. But Parwez takes a systems-level approach to the root of the word Takwa. He completely strips away the passive piety.
If it's not piety, what is it? Because I always see it translated as righteousness.
Well, in this framework, Takwa is active, strategic self-preservation.
Interesting.
It is an urgent, conscious effort to protect yourself, your family, and your community from the inevitable destruction that a broken, unjust system brings upon itself. It is the awareness that the bridge is going to collapse, and taking the proactive measures to ensure you aren't standing underneath it when the concrete falls.
I struggle with this a bit, though. I mean, if Takwa is just self-preservation, isn't that just a fancy ancient word for prepper culture?
Right.
Like hoarding canned goods, buying gold, and moving to an underground bunker. How does that actually solve the societal issue?
Okay. That's because it's not individualistic survivalism. You have to pair Takwa with the next concept Parwez introduces, which is rububiyya.
Okay, what's that?
This is the absolute linchpin of the entire sociological model. Rububiyya is the function of sustaining, providing, nurturing, and fulfilling the basic needs of life.
Okay, so food, shelter, security, economic access.
All of it. And Parwez points out that the text demands this function of rububiyya be reserved exclusively for the divine order, meaning for universal equitable law.
So practically speaking,
Right.
what does a society look like when it violates that?
The practical application is radical. You must take no human being as your ultimate provider, master, or sovereign.
Wow.
Right? The moment a human being, a corporation, or an entrenched political class monopolizes the resources of a society when they force the general population to become utterly dependent on their whims for basic survival, you have violated rububiyya.
You've allowed humans to play God with resources.
Exactly. And that is the microfracture in the bridge.
It is the primary cause of the earthquake.
Mathematically, a society that allows resource monopolies is a society that is accelerating toward collapse. So to go back to your question about prepper culture, Takwa isn't hiding in a bunker.
Right.
Takwa is the active resistance against human monopolies. It is building decentralized systems, demanding equitable laws, and refusing to participate in the concentration of power, because you know that concentration will eventually trigger the zalzala as sa.
That makes perfect sense. Let's look at a historical example just to ground this. Think about the French Revolution.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
For generations, the aristocracy and the monarchy completely monopolized the land, the food supply, and the wealth. They assumed total rububiyya.
And the peasantry was entirely dependent on them.
Exactly. The tension grilled for centuries until the socio-economic earthquake hit in 1789. The system snapped violently. And that brings us to the actual imagery used in the second verse to describe this collapse, because it is surreal.
It really is. The text provides incredibly vivid, almost hallucinatory descriptions.
It does. It talks about mountains trembling and being uprooted. It describes nursing mothers suddenly dropping their infants in shock and people staggering around, appearing to be drunk without wine. The Arabic term there is sukara.
Right.
If we establish that this isn't a geological event or magic, what on earth are we looking at? Are we talking about a literal tectonic shift causing mass amnesia?
No, we have to read this through the lens of classical Arabic idiom. These are sophisticated metaphors for the sheer terror and cognitive disorientation of profound societal upheaval.
Okay, break that down.
Think about the sociological function of a mountain.
Yeah.
In a landscape, a mountain is the ultimate symbol of permanence and immovability.
So the trembling mountains that get uprooted are the elites.
Exactly. They represent the entrenched chiefs, the oligarchs, the power brokers who imagined that their monopolies were the bedrock of reality. They thought their power was a permanent fixture of the earth.
But then the earthquake hits.
Right. And when the systemic collapse hits, these seemingly permanent power structures are tossed aside like tufts of wool.
They realize they are standing on quicksand.
And the imagery of the nursing mothers and the people staggering around drunk without wine sukara is perhaps the most profound psychological observation in the text.
It represents the sheer cognitive dissonance of a general population witnessing their entire reality disintegrate.
Exactly. Because a mother's instinct to protect her nursing infant is arguably the most primal, deeply hardwired biological imperative in human nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
The text is saying that the terror of systemic collapse, the absolute evaporation of order, security, and predictability, creates a psychological shock so profound that it temporarily short-circuits even our deepest biological instincts.
So they are intoxicated by alcohol.
No, they are intoxicated by terror. They are staggering under the weight of a paradigm shift they literally cannot comprehend.
There's a historical anecdote from the source material that illustrates the sociology of this kind of trauma beautifully. It takes place in the aftermath of the Battle of Bedir.
Oh, yeah. It is a vital piece of context for understanding what a collapsing power structure looks like from the inside.
So the elite of Mecca, these wealthy power brokers who view themselves as the immovable mountains of the Arabian Peninsula, they suffer a completely catastrophic, humiliating defeat at Bedir.
Their leadership is wiped out.
Right. Their monopoly on power is shattered. And they were so devastated and so terrified of showing weakness to the surrounding tribes that the surviving elites issued a strict totalitarian decree, absolutely no public mourning.
Wow.
They forbade anyone in Mecca from crying for the dead, attempting to hide the extent of their systemic collapse.
It's the classic defense mechanism of a dying regime. Maintain the optics of control at all costs, even if it means suffocating the basic humanity of your own people.
Right. And there's this story of a woman in Mecca who had lost her closest loved ones in the battle. She is utterly devastated, but the state has forbidden her from processing her grief. Eventually, she is sitting in her home, and she hears someone wailing loudly in the distance.
She desperately hopes the decree has been lifted, right?
Exactly. So she sends her servant to find out. The servant comes back and reports, no, the ban is still in place. That woman isn't mourning the soldiers. She is just crying because she lost her camel.
And the grieving woman's response highlights the sheer cruelty of a collapsing system.
She basically says she is allowed to weep for a beast of burden, but I cannot shed a single tear for the destruction of my family.
That anecdote is not just a sad story. It is the mechanical definition of the earthquake. The collapse of a society isn't just a change in administration or a drop in GDP.
No.
It is a psychological terror and a profound disgrace where the system becomes so inverted, so broken, that human beings cannot even openly process their own trauma. The oppression reaches into their very ability to grieve. That is what it means to stagger around Sukhara, drunk on the suffocation of a collapsing order.
Which logically leads to the biggest question. How do we avoid it?
Right?
If a collapsing system is that destructive, how do we actually fix a society before the load-bearing pillars snap? Because clearly, nobody wants to live through the mountains crumbling.
This requires us to look at the mechanics of societal change. Parwez brings in a core principle from the broader text to explain this, la ikraha fi din.
Which is usually translated as, there is no compulsion in religion.
Yes, but in a sociological framework, din refers to a way of life, a systemic social order. The principle states that a divine, equitable order, true, lasting systemic change, can never, under any circumstances, be imposed by coercion. You cannot force a thriving society from the top down by the barrel of a gun.
This makes me think of the distinction between a military coup and a genuine revolution.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
You can march the army into the capital, take over the broadcasting station, and declare that the country has a new ideology. But if the people haven't bought into it, you haven't actually changed the society.
You've just changed the hostage takers.
Exactly.
Parwez notes that historically, prophets did not arrive with standing armies to enforce compliance. They brought a new social contract. They brought an entirely new paradigm of human dignity and equitable resource distribution.
So how does the change actually happen?
Parwez argues that real, sustainable external revolution only happens as a natural byproduct of a profound internal shift in the population. He uses the term taghayur nafs, the transformation of the internal psychological and intellectual state.
This connects to Quran 13.11, right?
Yeah.
The idea that a society's condition does not change until the people themselves change what is within their own psyches.
Yes. Parwez quotes the philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal here, who summarized the sociological rule brilliantly Until the heart testifies, there is no real change.
That's powerful.
You can rewrite the Constitution, you can change the tax brackets, you can redesign the flag, but until the cognitive and moral framework of the population actually shifts, the system remains fundamentally unchanged.
Until the heart testifies.
Okay.
That is a staggering bar for systemic change. But this is exactly where the modern world clashes violently with this text.
Oh, absolutely.
Because today, our entire approach to societal change bypasses the heart completely. Parwez directly contrasts this organic, internal transformation with what he calls Iblis's weapon, the weapon of the devil, or in systemic terms, the ultimate destructive impulse.
It is a blistering critique of modern political architecture. Parwez identifies this weapon as the mass engineering of public opinion. We are talking about mass media, perpetual PR campaigns, superficial political processions, and the algorithmic manipulation of sentiment. He calls it a seduction by voices.
And we have to examine why this fails. Why doesn't a perfectly executed PR campaign count as tag your ENAFs?
Because it's superficial.
Right. But let's play this out. Let's say I run a political campaign. I spend $1 billion on targeted ads, I hire behavioral psychologists, and I successfully manipulate 51% of the population into voting for my new policy. I've changed the system, haven't I?
No, you've changed the optics. And the mechanical reason this fails is cognitive dissonance. When you use propaganda and behavioral nudges to manipulate public opinion, you are bypassing the intellect.
You're hacking them.
You are hacking human psychology to elicit a temporary reaction. But because the people haven't undergone the hard internal work of intellectual and moral transformation, their new opinion is incredibly fragile.
It has no roots.
Exactly. It has no root in their actual worldview. So a society that relies on engineered public opinion is building its entire foundation on sand. The moment the PR budget runs dry, or the moment a more sophisticated, more seductive algorithm comes along, the public opinion instantly shifts back or shifts toward a new extreme. It is completely hollow.
It's the illusion of progress. We treat civilizational survival as a branding exercise. If a corporation is destroying the environment, they don't change their extraction methods, they just change their logo to green and run commercials about sustainability.
Yes.
They manipulate the opinion, but the material reality of the extraction continues.
And the laws of social physics do not care about your marketing campaign. You cannot hack the law of gravity, and you cannot hack the socioeconomic mechanics of collapse. A system built on engineered opinion rather than internal conviction is inherently unstable. It is merely delaying the inevitable earthquake.
Okay, but this forces a difficult realization. If the mechanics of collapse are this rigid, and the requirement for real internal change is this obvious, why is there so much resistance?
Well,
Why do people fight so viciously against equitable reform when they can clearly see the bridge cracking?
this is the pivot Parwez makes into the psychology of the elite. He addresses this by analyzing a specific phrase repeated in verses 22.3 and 22.8, man yujadilu fillahi bighairi ilm.
Which means?
This translates to those who dispute and argue about fundamental universal laws without any actual knowledge, without guidance, and without an illuminating book, meaning without any evidence, data, or rational framework.
I have to play devil's advocate here. Are we sure these people aren't just genuinely ignorant? Maybe they just don't have access to the data. Maybe the educational systems have failed them, and they're arguing from a place of genuine, albeit misguided, belief.
This is where Parwez's analysis is brilliantly cynical and, honestly, deeply necessary. He refuses to give them the benefit of the doubt. He analyzes this behavior strictly as the defense mechanism of vested interests.
Okay?
When you observe entrenched elites or anyone heavily benefiting from a corrupt status quo, engaging in endless bad faith arguments against necessary reform, you have to understand that the quarrel is rarely about intellectual truth.
They aren't actually confused by the science or the economics?
Not at all. Think about the historical examples. When the tobacco industry spent decades arguing that nicotine wasn't addictive, or when fossil fuel conglomerates funded think tanks to deny climate change, they weren't lacking an illuminating book.
No, they had the internal memos.
They had the data.
So the argument is just a smokescreen.
The argument is rooted entirely in selfish desire and the absolute refusal to surrender systemic privilege. They argue without evidence because their goal isn't to discover the truth. Their goal is to stall progress long enough to extract the last remaining profits from the current system.
Wow.
Parwez notes that the text says this behavior follows every rebellious shaitan. In this sociological context, a shaitan is any systemic disruptor or selfish urge that prioritizes personal, short-term gain over the collective, long-term survival of the society.
And what is the ultimate fate of these vested interests? Because they seem to be the ones winning in the short term. The text uses a very specific word for their end state, mareed.
Yes, mareed. And the linguistic root of this word is fascinating. It fundamentally means deprivation or being stripped of all good.
But wait, that seems contradictory.
Yeah.
These are the people hoarding all the wealth, the real estate, the political influence. They have a monopoly on the resources. How does a framework of social physics conclude that the hoarders end up deprived?
It is the ultimate mathematical irony of systemic corruption. By clinging desperately to a broken system to protect their short-term profits, these vested interests engineer their own permanent deprivation. Think about it biologically. It's the logic of a parasite.
A parasite that gets so greedy it consumes the host entirely.
Exactly. A successful parasite extracts just enough to live, but leaves the host alive to sustain it. But a rapacious parasite consumes the host until the host dies. And what happens to the parasite?
It dies too.
Because it has destroyed its own ecosystem.
Huh?
If you hoard all the resources to the point where the society cannot function, where the earthquake hits, what good is your wealth?
If the currency collapses, your $1 billion are just paper. If the supply chains shatter, your gated community can't get food.
By refusing to adapt to equitable laws, the elites ensure their own absolute ruin. They argue their way into their own extinction.
Which leads us perfectly to the underlying engine of the universe that Parwez outlines next cause and effect. If you can't cheat the system through PR and you can't argue your way out of a broken structure, it's because you are bound by a rigid law.
Parwez introduces the concept of Makafat-e-Amal, the law of requital. In this framework, the universe operates on a strict mathematical system of consequences.
Okay?
There is no arbitrary divine wrath. God does not sit in the sky throwing lightning bolts out of anger. And conversely, there is no magical unearned forgiveness. Every single action, and even the intent driving the action, registers a consequence within the system.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. This is where philosophical frameworks often shatter against the rocks of reality.
Let's hear it.
Look at the 2008 financial crisis. You had architects of a massive, fraudulent, subprime mortgage system. They crashed the global economy. Millions of vulnerable people lost their homes, their pensions, their livelihoods. That was the earthquake. But the architects, the bankers, they largely kept their bonuses. They were bailed out by the state, and they're still sitting on yachts. So how does the law of requital account for the fact that people explicitly cheat the system and escape the consequences?
It is an essential question, and Parwez answers it by dissecting our flawed perception of time. The issue with your 2008 example isn't that the law failed. It's that human beings are incredibly impatient, and we view time as fragmented segments.
Right. We want immediate results.
We think in terms of quarterly earnings and news cycles. If an action doesn't produce an immediate, highly visible consequence tomorrow, we assume the perpetrator got away with it.
We want the instant karma. We want the lightning bolt.
But Parwez explains that the text views past, present, and future as a continuous, unbroken ledger. The delay in a consequence does not negate the law. The consequence is woven into the very fabric of the action itself, and it will manifest when the systemic conditions reach critical mass.
So, mechanically, how did the 2008 bankers not get away with it?
By bailing out the architects of the crash without structural reform, the society didn't cancel the consequence, it merely transferred the rot deeper into the foundation.
Oh, wow.
The immediate consequence was avoided, but the long-term harvest was the complete erosion of institutional trust. The consequence of 2008 is the populist rage, the extreme political polarization, and the total lack of faith in democratic institutions we see today. The fire didn't burn the bankers immediately. It is currently burning the very system that protects them.
That reframes accountability entirely. The text uses this haunting phrase, bima quadamat yadak, which translates to what your hands have sent forth.
It is the ultimate statement of systemic responsibility. The disgrace in this world, which Parwez refers to as kizi, and the eventual fire of a collapsed society, are not punishments imposed by an emotional deity.
They're just math.
They are the literal, inescapable harvest of a society's own prior deeds. God is not unjust to his servants. The system he designed is perfectly equitable. The output is strictly determined by the input.
Parwez offers a brilliant visceral analogy for this to make it concrete. Imagine a person who starts consuming small amounts of heavy metals or poison in their youth.
Think of lead pipes in the Roman Empire.
Right. They drink the water, and they feel fine for years. They might go decades thinking they are completely immune, thinking they have cheated biology, but then, in their old age, their bones become brittle, their nervous system begins to fail, and their body collapses.
The poison didn't magically become toxic 50 years later. It was accumulating in the bone marrow the entire time. The failing bones are the inevitable harvest of the poison. The consequence was delayed, but it was never in doubt.
So, when we look at our own societal crises, whether it's an economic crash, ecological disaster, or political anarchy, we have to stop asking, why is God doing this to us?
Yeah.
The universe isn't out to get us. Our own systemic inputs are finally rendering their outputs. The ledger is balancing itself.
It is a terrifying realization, but it is also profoundly empowering. You are not at the mercy of arbitrary fate or superstitious curses. You are bound by the physics of your own choices.
Okay, but let me pivot us to the more optimistic side of the text, because otherwise this is a masterclass in existential dread.
Believe it or not.
If a society has actually reached the point of the earthquake, if the bridge has collapsed under the weight of its own bad inputs, is it dead forever? Is there a mechanism for recovery, or is it just permanent ruins?
This is where Parwez introduces the physics of revival, centered on the concept of Ba'ath. Now, just like Asa, Ba'ath has been heavily mystified by traditional commentators. They translate it as resurrection and conjure up images of a literal, zombie-like rising from a physical grave at the end of time.
Apocalyptic imagery again.
But within the context of social physics, Ba'ath is not a magical resurrection of corpses. It is the clearing of obstacles to allow new life to emerge from a dead nation. It is the mechanics of societal rebirth in this world.
To explain this, Parwez draws a fascinating scientific parallel referencing Albert Einstein's thoughts on biology. He compares the revival of a dead society to the emergence of the very first life cell from inanimate matter.
It's a profound connection. Parwez asked the listener to look at the origins of biological life. Billions of years ago, the Earth was entirely inanimate matter. It was rock, gas, and water. There was zero biological life. And yet, from that seemingly barren, dead environment, the first living cell emerged.
How does that apply to sociology?
It proves that the potential for life was latent within the inanimate matter all along, waiting for the precise conditions to actualize. Parwez argues that the revival of a dead civilization operates on the exact same principle. A collapsed society might look like rubble, but the human potential for equity and innovation is still latent within the survivors.
The text leans heavily into biological metaphors to drive this home. It breaks down the stages of human embryonic development with almost clinical detail. It talks about the transition from nutfa, a drop of fluid, to alaka, a clinging clot, to mugga, a chewed-like lump of tissue, before eventually forming a shaped human being.
Yeah.
Why does a treatise on sociology suddenly turn into an anatomy textbook?
The text explicitly states its pedagogical purpose, limubayina lakum, to make it manifest to you, or to make the invisible visible. When you look at an early-stage embryo, a muga, it does not look like a human being. It looks like formless tissue. If you didn't know better, you would think it was just a mass of cells.
Right.
But the entire architectural blueprint of a complex, thriving, sentient human being, the brain, the nervous system, the heart, is encoded and latent within that microscopic structure. It is entirely invisible to the naked eye, but its potential is absolute.
So Parwez is telling us that even in the darkest, most formless, chaotic stage of societal collapse, when everything looks like ruins, the blueprint for a thriving, equitable civilization is still there. It's encoded in human nature.
Yes. And the catalyst that unlocks this latent blueprint is described through another powerful natural metaphor, rain falling on dead earth.
Oh, I like that imagery.
Imagine a barren, parched desert landscape. The soil is cracked. It looks entirely lifeless. But the moment a steady, life-giving rain hits that earth, latent seeds that were buried inches below the surface seeds that were completely invisible suddenly vibrate, swell, and burst into bloom.
The desert transforms overnight.
The potential was never dead. It was merely dormant, waiting for the right catalyst. Parwez argues that divine universal values, equitable laws, justice, human dignity operate the same way on a dead civilization.
They act like the rain.
Exactly. When a broken, traumatized society finally embraces equitable laws, those values act like rain on parched earth. They nourish the dormant human potential that was suppressed by the previous tyranny. They clear the obstacles, allowing a vibrant new social order to bloom. That is the true meaning of Ba'ath.
Okay, I see how a society can be revived from the ashes.
Yeah.
But the ultimate goal of a systems engineer is to build a structure that doesn't collapse in the first place, right?
Naturally.
So how do we design a society so that it never reaches the earthquake phase? What is the actual architectural blueprint for permanence?
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of Parwez's analysis, the architecture of Al-Haq.
Al-Haq is a very common term, usually just translated as the truth, right?
Yes, but in Parwez's framework, it demands a much more rigorous, pragmatic definition. For him, Al-Haq is not an abstract philosophical concept that theologians debate in an ivory tower. Al-Haq is an absolute, constructive reality that always produces tangible, observable, positive results.
If it doesn't work in practice, it isn't the truth.
Exactly. If a system claims to be built on divine truth, but it results in poverty, extreme inequality, systemic trauma, and the suppression of human flourishing, then it isn't hack, it's an illusion. Truth, in social physics, must manifest as equity and security in reality.
So how do you build a system of hack? Parwez provides a mechanical analogy that I think is the most memorable takeaway from this entire lecture.
Yeah.
Is the metaphor of the socket and the door.
It perfectly encapsulates the tension at the heart of all civilizations, the balance between permanence and change. Parwez asks us to imagine a functioning, equitable civilization as a massive, heavy wooden door.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
For a door to serve its purpose, to allow movement while providing security, it requires two distinct opposing components. First, it needs the socket, the hinges, and the frame. This represents the immutable, permanent values of a society.
The bedrock.
Right. These are the non-negotiable principles: absolute justice, human dignity, the law of requital, the prohibition of monopolies, which is rubia. These principles must be drilled deep into the bedrock of the society. They must never shift or move. If the frame shifts, the entire structure loses its integrity.
Right. You can't compromise on basic human dignity.
But what is the second component? It is the door panel itself. The panel represents the practical laws, the economic policies, the technological adaptations, and the day-to-day methods of governance.
And the panel moves.
And unlike the socket, the door panel must continuously swing. It has to open and close, constantly adapting to changing circumstances, new technologies, and evolving human needs.
This is brilliant. Let me crystallize the implication here, because this answers so much about modern political dysfunction. If you take the door panel, the daily rules and traditional policies, and you freeze it, if you nail it shut to the frame because you are terrified of the modern world and you want to preserve the past, it ceases to be a door. It becomes a brick wall.
Progress stops, innovation dies.
The society becomes rigid, suffocates, and eventually shatters under the pressure of a changing world. That is the deadly flaw of extreme conservatism and fundamentalism. They confuse the door panel for the socket.
Precisely. But Parwez warns equally against the opposite extreme. If the society decides that everything should be flexible and progressive, and they loosen the socket if they abandon the permanent, immutable values of absolute justice and dignity in the name of unmoored progress or moral relativism, what happens?
The entire door crashes to the floor. The society collapses into total anarchy because it has no foundational structure.
That is the danger of pure relativism. The architecture of Al-Haq demands the synthesis of both. You need an unyielding, fanatical commitment to permanent moral values, paired with a relentless, pragmatic willingness to adapt the execution of those values to the present day. You need the immovable socket to hold the swinging door.
That is profound. It strips away all the noise of modern political debates and reduces it down to structural integrity. But as we wrap up, I want to connect this massive sociological theory directly to you, the listener. Because looking at this blueprint is one thing, but diagnosing our current reality is another.
Yeah, that's the real test.
How do we know if our own society or even our own corporate structures or community organizations are approaching the earthquake?
Yeah.
What is the final diagnostic warning sign before the collapse?
Parwez delivers one final, deeply sobering insight to answer that. He argues that the death of a civilization isn't initially marked by a sudden lack of wealth or a military defeat or a technological failure. The ultimate terminal warning sign is the loss of what he calls exegesis, the loss of the sense of loss.
The loss of the sense of loss. Walk me through the mechanics of that.
It happens when a society completely normalizes its own corruption. It is the moment when people who acquire immense wealth or power through clearly unjust, exploitative means are no longer viewed with disgrace, but are instead honored, put on magazine covers, and celebrated as successful.
It's the death of the collective conscience.
It is the moment a society looks at something fundamentally wrong. A system that crushes the vulnerable, a market that rewards cruelty, leaders who lie shamelessly, and the population can no longer muster the moral clarity or the energy to call it wrong. They just shrug and say, well, that's just the way the world works. That's just business.
They lose the ability to even recognize the sickness. They are staring at the broken X-ray and calling it a healthy bone.
Exactly. When a society loses its exegesis, it loses its moral immune system. It forfeits its claim to the reign of revival because it doesn't even realize it needs to be healed. When a society reaches that point of cynical complacency, Parwez argues, it is mathematically slated for collapse. The earthquake is no longer a possibility. It is a systemic certainty.
Wow. We started this hour trying to diagnose the mechanics of ancient civilizations, and we've ended up staring right into the mirror of modern human complacency. The mechanics of civilizational survival are incredibly clear, but doing the internal work that your ENAFs is where the real challenge lies.
It is a blueprint that demands unrelenting vigilance. You cannot put it on autopilot.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. We spend so much of our lives optimizing ourselves to succeed within our current systems. We hustle, we network, we try to win the game as it's currently designed. But if a system itself is structurally corrupt, if it lags the permanent socket of justice and relies on the monopoly of rububiyya, are your daily successes actually just you piling more freight onto a bridge that is guaranteed to collapse?
That's the real question.
Look at your own environment tomorrow, whether it's your workplace, your community, or your country. Are you doing the hard work of moving the door while fiercely protecting the frame? Or are you just staring at a brick wall and trying to convince yourself it's a passageway? You don't need a medical degree to feel when the bones of your society are grinding together. You just have to be willing to trust your exegesis, look at the muddy waters, and call the break exactly what it is.